Tomorrow's the 4th of July, and here in the US, that means the air is about to become very thick with flags and fireworks and claims of God and country. You'll hear pastors and apologists talk about how America was built off biblical values. Politicians will talk about how the founding fathers were good men of God. You'll hear the term Christian nation tossed around so casually as if it was etched into the Constitution itself. But what if these things are not true? What if the people who built this country, the actual flesh and blood humans behind the ideas of liberty and independence, thought or believed very differently, or at least different than what we've been told and for the reasons that we've been told it? And so that's what we're going to cover today. I want to look at the founding fathers. I want to look at the birth of this great nation, not through cynicism or even speculation, but from the words of these men themselves, try to get a more accurate idea of what they believed and why, and how it played a part or did not in the founding of this nation. A couple caveats, and we're going to dive right in. Number one, yeah, this is going to be a bit political, if that's what you want to call it. That doesn't mean I've gone political. That doesn't mean this is now a political channel. And if it's not for you to hear anything about America or a country or the founding fathers, or if this is a Christian nation, no problem, you can skip this one. But this is an episode about history. This is an episode about great thinkers. After all, it's a Thinking Thursday episode. And tomorrow is a celebration of the independence of this country. And so, yeah, we're gonna be just a hair political. Second caveat, this is not about vilifying or glorifying any of the men that we speak about. It's about being honest. It's about trying to get the correct information instead of all the propaganda that has been told to us from many different sides. Yes, many of them were morally compromised. They were slaveholders. They were elitist, which is a bigger issue, I think, if you're going to continue to claim that they wanted to found a nation on their values that they got from Christianity. I'm actually doing Christians a favor here and letting you off the hook a little bit for that. But also, many were brilliant visionaries, leaders, economists, military. And yeah, their religious beliefs were complicated, nuanced even, maybe inconsistent, or also evolving. We'll try to talk about how some of them changed over time. What unites them is not a shared faith. That's the point. It was a shared belief in freedom. And it all started with men that weren't agreeing religiously, nor did they try to make that the basis for this, but they found other values rooted well outside of Judeo-Christian values that laid the groundwork for something special. So, without further ado, let's get into this. I said we'd start with what we think we know as a country, what we typically portray as the history, the story here with our founding fathers. A powerful cultural myth that the founding fathers were all devout Christians who wanted to build a nation rooted in biblical Christianity. This idea has influenced so much, from actual court decisions to school policies to the language that we use in political debates. But it is just a myth, and it does collapse under scrutiny. Did you know that the Constitution does not mention God, Jesus, or Christianity? Don't you think that's fascinating, considering what we are so often told? We know that several of the founders were actually anti-clerical. We know that others believed in a creator, again, deists, but rejected miracles, rejected the Trinity, rejected the church and the divinity of Jesus. Sorry, that's just not Christian. But the myth persists because it's convenient, because it's useful, because it can be used as a tool for control and power. But let me read a powerful quote that many of you are going to have a problem with, and I'm going to handle the objections for that in just a second. The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That is a direct quote from the Treaty of Tripoli, Article 11, 1797, unanimously ratified by the U.S. Senate and signed by the President John Adams. We have that. That's real. I'm not making it up. And yes, Christians that don't like that have made many excuses, and I think it's going to be worthwhile to cover it, but we're going to get to that. But right before we do, I want to show you quickly the evolution of religion in this country. Why do people even have the idea that this country is all about religious freedom and coming here and practicing religion and building a Christian nation? Why? Where did it come from? Well, blame the Puritans. You have the Pilgrims and Puritans here in the 1600s. It's very early. This is 150 years before the Founding Fathers. And yes, they did in fact come to the New World for religious freedom for them. Not for everybody. It's the most important distinction and one that so many people seemingly cannot or have not grasped. And again, this early colonial period is not the same as the founding of the nation that happens 150 years roughly later. The truth is the U.S. Constitution specifically broke away from that idea, from the theocratic mindset. The founders were far more influenced with Enlightenment philosophy than they were Christian theology, let alone Puritan dogma. By the way, if you want a fun example of just how well that little Puritan experiment went, see this video here. So the Puritans founded colonies, and then later the founders built a secular republic. But history is confusing, so I don't even blame people for getting this wrong unless they're trying to sell a certain agenda from the pulpit or something. So you have the 1600 Puritans, then get into the Founding Fathers, but right after that, in the 1800s, we do get kind of a religious revolution, and I think that that's also why people get it all conflated. A wave of evangelical Christianity completely reshaped America in the early to mid 1800s. And in doing so, it recast our founding fathers as these proto-evangelicals. Despite the fact, of course, and again, that many of them, I'm thinking Paine and Jefferson and Franklin, would have detested evangelical theology. And it was easy because Christians have always been good at one particular skill: cherry picking. There's enough vague references to providence or a creator for them to map on Christianity onto some of the deist beliefs of some of the founding fathers and just call the whole thing Christian. And then that gets even more heavily solidified post-Civil War. This is another great reshaping of America because we had a national identity crisis. So we need a new moral framework, a rebrand, if you will. And so we start getting more of this Christian imagery. Things like one nation under God and in God we trust start creeping into the political language, even though it was not there at our founding. And by the way, that's fine. Countries are allowed to evolve. I don't care about whatever point I might help or hurt the Christian with. I just care about what's true. What's the actual part of history? If your God is real and America is mainly filled with Christians, why do you need to lie about this? Because when it comes time to further your political or religious agenda, being able to point back to our earliest founders and documents and try to smuggle Jesus and Christianity into them is powerful. But that's manipulation, it's hypocrisy, and it's deceit. It was after the Civil War where you start getting the schools and the textbooks and everything else that just came together to paint the founding fathers as these heroic, perfect Christian men. And then you jump forward to the 1950s with what is usually referred to as Cold War Christianity. How do you oppose godless communism? By ramping up the American Christian rhetoric. So in 1954, under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And in 1956, in God we trust becomes the official U.S. motto. These were modern inventions in response to what's going on in the culture, but they are not founding principles. But again, the deceit is that they were framed as if they always were. It's just the weaponization of religion for modern political purposes. Sound familiar? Which kind of brings us to today, where we have this modern Christian nationalism and political power. Today, most evangelicals and Christian leaders still promote the idea that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. It is an important part of their propaganda. But why? Because it gives moral authority to their policy. The narrative also, of course, fuels this sense of entitlement and somehow persecution. We're losing our country to the atheists, to the Muslims, to the communists, whatever it is. Grouping, huddling back around the supposedly pure and beneficial and democratic Christianity that will save us all. So maybe that's important to understand. The myth of the Christian nation persists because it's useful politically, not because it's true historically. So, do you need to justify conquest? Do you need to stabilize the culture? Do you need to win elections? What about get people on your side for ideological war? Well, no problem. just appeal to the Christian nation that supposedly the U.S. is. Sorry, I wanted to give just a bit of pushback on the counters that will come about that quote from the Tripoli letter. Let me read the quote one more time. The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Doesn't seem to get any more clear than that. So how can Christians argue it? Well, they're pretty creative. The very most popular one is that they claim it was just a diplomatic move. It's not representative of what the founding fathers actually believed. Yeah, it was definitely diplomatic language and used in a diplomatic fashion, but that doesn't weaken its point or its stance. In fact, it strengthens it. This was an official document. This isn't private correspondence or some campaign rhetoric. The government was clarifying its identity on a world stage. And the Senate, many of who included the founding fathers or their contemporaries, unanimously agreed. No one objected to this phrasing. That's a literal fact of history. Pushback number 2 is that line is not actually found in all editions. Christians love to play the context game and the textual variance game when it suits them, just not with their own holy book. And it's true. Article 11 is not found in some of the Arab copies, but in the official English document, the one ratified by the U.S. Senate, again unanimously, it is there. What a weak point. How reaching do you have to be to try to lie about this? How stupid to lie about this in the first place? My favorite personal excuse that I've heard about this is, okay, well, fine, but that's just one document. It's not like that represents the entire nation. Please remember that for all of the other horrific excuses you make where you try to pull one out of context thing into a context that totally disagrees with it to defeat that initial greater context. No, one document never means everything, but this document works with everything else we know about the founding fathers to add to the real context we have that they weren't Christians trying to build a Christian nation. Look at the full body of evidence here. Again, the Constitution doesn't mention anything concerning Jesus, God, or Christianity. Then you have Jefferson's Virginia statute for religious freedom. You have Madison's opposition to state-supported clergy, and then the personal writings of the founders that we're about to go through. So yes, the Treaty of Tripoli fits into a larger pattern of secular governance and religious neutrality. Come on, what are we talking about here? But okay, I needed to cover that because I didn't want to hear it in the comments. Let's get into the founding fathers themselves. So, in an attempt to honor truth, as well as the actual genius of the founding fathers and what they created for us, we have to peel back the mythology of it all and take an honest look at them for what they were. Complex, flawed, thoughtful, ambitious men building something unprecedented. These were not just priests with their powdered wigs, which is how they're so often displayed and talked about. And it's a shame because I think truly, and it's my point of interest, that the founding of this nation is one of the most interesting things that has ever happened in history. And some of the main players, these key characters, these founding fathers are truly such unique and amazing people to learn about, flaws and all. This is history. It is reality, and it is wildly fascinating and does not need to be manipulated, lied about, or watered down in the ways that it has. So let's dive into the founding fathers. We're going to cover 10 of them one by one, what they believed, how we know it, and just give you a better idea of who these men were. Let's start with one of my favorite people to read about. I've read 3 separate biographies. I absolutely love the history that this man has been a part of, even his being the one that sends out Lewis and Clark. If you haven't read Undaunted Courage, that's today's book recommendation. And it opens with a couple chapters on Jefferson that are pretty fascinating. So what did Jefferson believe? Well, he is famously a deist, heavily influenced by Enlightenment rationalism. He's closest to Unitarian in his theology, rejecting the Trinity, divine revelation, and miracles themselves. You've probably heard of the Jefferson Bible. That actually happened a little bit later in his life, where he starts tearing out any reference to the divine or miracles. He just wanted the moral framework from some parts of the Bible, just like he did with all the other philosophy that he read, enjoyed, and included in his leadership and decision making. He did say he liked some of the moral teachings of Jesus, but he straight up also rejected the divinity of Jesus. And again, the Jefferson Bible, I believe, was just the Gospels with the removal of miracles and divine, not the whole Bible, just to clarify. Let me give you some quotes. These are real, historical, factual quotes that we have from Jefferson. Christianity neither is nor ever was a part of the common law. This was in a private letter to Dr. Thomas Cooper in 1814. The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. That was a letter to John Adams in April 11, 1823. I am of a sect by myself, as far as I know. That's to Ezra Stiles in 1819. In every country and in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. That is a letter to Horatio Spafford in 1814. We have this. We know this. This is what he thought. Also, it is he himself that authored the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which deeply shaped the First Amendment, which we'll talk about. You do have some of his quotes about nature's God. This would be kind of like a Spinoza God, or again, just deism at large. Christians pounce on that and they try to morph it into their personal God, but it only works if you don't know anything else about this man, what he said or what he wrote. And yeah, he attended church services at the Capitol. That's true. Another point Christians tried to make. But also the services then, they were non-sectarian, and Jefferson saw them as a test of church-state separation. Okay, we won't take that long for all of them, but we do have that much information and more for everybody. So please just know it's not like you have to cherry pick one thing here or there. That's what Christians have to do because it doesn't exist, the narrative that they want from the founding fathers. So I'll go a little bit quicker here. Let's talk about John Adams. He's a Unitarian. He rejects the Trinity, the virgin birth, and he did not believe in eternal punishment. That separates him from like 95% of Christians in America today. He believed in a rational God. He believed in moral order, but he despised religious dogma. And to be fair, he did consider Christianity valuable, only in its ethics, not in its doctrine. Let me give you some quotes, though. This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it. A letter to Jefferson in 1817. The divinity of Jesus is made a convenient cover for absurdity. To Vonderkamp in 1816. And the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion because, again, it was he that signed the Treaty of Tripoli. He helped shape a government that had no religious test for leadership. He was publicly harsh on superstition and organized religion. And Christians do often claim that he affirmed Christianity. But again, if you read him, he affirmed social or even cultural Christianity, which I think Christians still can't really understand the difference, not theological Christianity. Nuance really can be a hard thing for dogmatic believers. All right, let's move on to Ben Franklin, an early deist, skeptical of miracles and Christian doctrine. He believed in a creator of some kind, and he based his morality off of reason and usefulness. So very pragmatic. Now, he did grow more religious later in life, as many often do, but he never did accept the supernatural claims of Christianity. Just point blank, here's some quotes. I have found Christian dogma unintelligible. Early in life, I absented myself from Christian assemblies. That's from his autobiography in 1791. The way to see faith is to shut the eye of reason. This is from Poor Richard's Almanac, which everyone should read for its secular wit. There are so many sayings like this. In a letter to Ezra Stiles in 1790, he says, I think vital religion has always suffered when orthodoxy is more regarded than virtue. Now, I always want to represent both sides. What is the Christian going to say? What is their claim to the Christianity of Ben Franklin? Well, he called for prayer. That's got to mean something, right? At the Constitutional Convention, he called for prayer. But you know what? It was ignored, and he did not insist on it in any way, shape, or form. Again, if anything, him just saying, anybody want to pray? And everyone's like, nah, we good, is pretty darn telling of where people were at in the founding of this nation. And I have read his autobiography many times. In fact, I had a tradition where I used to read it at the beginning of each year because it is excellent for kind of the New Year's resolution kind of deal. And if you actually read him, it becomes unbelievably clear that he is okay with religion as a cultural force of some type. Maybe even that he could value that, but not that there was any divine truth in it. Let's get to Washington himself, who was extremely reserved on religion and was likely a deist, best that we could guess. By the way, again, not trying to get them in my club any more than Christians try to get them in their club, but A lot of people that would probably be atheist today were simply deist back then. We didn't have the same kind of knowledge that we have now. Some of the things that have closed the gaps where you needed God to exist, a God of any kind. Nor was it culturally acceptable or politically useful. And so, even though none of these are claimed straight up atheist, so to speak, many of them fall much more on that side of humanism and secularism than they do on the religious side. Now, he did attend sometimes an Anglican church, but he never participated in communion, and he never references Jesus one time anywhere. So if he was a Christian, he was bad at it. That's the other thing I love. Like, let's just give you all of this, and all of these people are Christian. The way they act, what they don't talk about, when they don't pray, what they didn't put into the founding of their country. The average Christian today would say they're not real Christians, but they have absolutely no problem for the first time ever not playing the no true Scotsman fallacy card, and instead taking these people and trying to turn them into it because, again, it's useful. Where is truth? Nowhere in the Christian agenda is the answer. By the way, Washington also avoided public prayer and got in trouble with his pastor for refusing to take communion. So, again, not the Christian you want to hold up on the pedestal. Let's move on to our halfway point here and talk about James Madison, and I'm going to speed up for these last ones. Likely a deist of Unitarian belief, but deeply secular in his political thought. He believed that mixing religion and government was toxic for both. Here's a couple quotes. "Religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together." That's to Edward Livingston in 1822. Then he says, "Who does not see the same authority which can establish Christianity may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians." This is from 1785, so earlier. This is the father of the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. This is a man who opposed congressional chaplains, as well as public funding for religious groups. He rarely talked about God in any of his personal letters, and he never once mentioned Jesus. So there's your first 5, and I feel like we're batting 0 in terms of making a case that any of them were Christian or supported a Christian founding of the nation. What about Thomas Paine? Oh, a fierce deist he is. He went even further. He completely rejected Christianity, 100% across the board. He said it was immoral and incoherent. He believed in reason and nature, and even universal morality. Here's some quotes, and man, could there be so many from him. The Age of Reason is such a wonderful book. We're actually going to be doing it and him as its own Thinking Thursday episode. But here's a few quotes from The Age of Reason. This is 1794. "The Christian religion is a parody of the worship of the sun. Next, my mind is my own church. Next, belief in a cruel God makes a cruel man." Yes, Thomas Paine gets it. We have Alexander Hamilton, who starts off very secular, but I think it's after the death of his son that he becomes ever so slightly more religious. That's when he joins the Episcopal Church later in his life. But some quotes here. "I have examined the evidence of the Christian religion. I should give my verdict in its favor." Now, this is disputed, and it is attributed to him after his death, so take it for what you will, but definitely want to call it out because Christians definitely try to use it. So again, you can have Alexander Hamilton if you want, but I think there's an interesting nuance to understand how opposed he was to Jefferson politically. And Jefferson has this whole secularism thing going, so Hamilton creates the Christian Constitutional Society to oppose Jefferson. Again, it seems to be more of a political play than a religious play. And if you look at the fine points of it, they're mainly political, not theological. And we know earlier in his life, he mocked religious influence, but we know later in his life, things changed for him. And that's okay. Now, does this one story about this one man only after he lost his child and opposed his political rival, utilizing the tool of religion, mean that our entire nation was founded off of Christian values specifically to the point where they should be infecting our society by law today? Of course not. James Monroe is another founding father that I think we should cover, although he was much more private about his religious belief. And because of that, we have no known religious affiliations, nor any writings that contain anything concerning any kind of theology. But I think the absence of that says something. Not once ever in his political career did he invoke the name of God nor Jesus. Christians actually go the other way with it, and they take his silence to mean belief. I don't know where you get that from, but whatever. Two more. Let's talk about Patrick Henry. This is your guy, Christians. This is who you want. He is openly and devoutly Christian. So, I'm just going to give it to you. He believed that America needed Christian moral guidance, but there is something interesting we can learn from his devoutness, because what was he fighting for and who was he fighting? Well, one, he opposed the Constitution, and on what grounds? That it didn't reference God, because it doesn't. Because the other members included, the other founding fathers, didn't want it to. People act like, oh, maybe it just was left out, maybe it doesn't say something one way or another. No, they had debates over if the wording should go in, and they chose not to. And we know that because of some of the very few devout Christians that complained about it. Henry here being one of them. A quote to show you the stark difference between someone who actually believes in Jesus during this time and someone that doesn't. Being a Christian is a character which I prize far above all this world has or can boast. So when you compare that against all the other quotes I have read you from all the other founding fathers, you see the stark contrast. You see the difference. This doesn't hurt the case. It makes the case. Last is Samuel Adams. He's raised Puritan, so still holding on to some of those values, and retained a moderately Christian worldview for everything that we can tell. He did believe in religious liberty, though, but for himself, he rooted it in Christian tradition. Some quotes here: "The right of the colonist as Christians may be best understood by reading the Christian Church." He says here, "Let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it elsewhere." And he absolutely did use Jesus to justify rights. He was kind of a blend between secular enlightenment and Christian ethics. So there's 10 of your founding fathers, and we see a lot of variance, right? These were men that argued with each other, debated each other, fought with each other, laughed with each other, agreed with each other, built a country together. And despite these differences, there are some common threads that I want to point out. One is religious liberty. No established national church. Yes, they disagreed about religion itself, but they did broadly agree that no single religious tradition should dominate public life, and that freedom of belief and of disbelief should be protected. Here's some key examples. You have the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Jefferson says, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pockets nor breaks my leg." I love that. Madison says religion is not within the cognizance of civil government. So no, they didn't ban religion from public life, and I don't think most atheists would want them to. That's nuance that I think we've lost. I mean, come on, they deliberately avoided privileging any one religion or even denomination. And sure, by the way, some states still had a state church, at least until the 1830s, but the federal government was always kept secular. Here's a second commonality that I think is important and that we should be learning from. Skepticism of the power of clergy, or a fear of religious tyranny. They knew what they came from. They wanted people to still believe whatever they wanted. They thought that some parts of religion were useful, but they did not want a Christian or religious nation. End of story. They distrusted religious leaders. They were scared of religious authority. They feared theocracy. So again, not necessarily anti-religious, but anti-clerical, and that's a very important distinction. And by the way, just because someone's not anti-religion doesn't mean they're pro your religion or your religious power. Here's commonality number 3, and one that is desperately needed again: the respect of and use of reason, enlightenment over revelation. These founders were children of the age of reason, not the age of faith. They valued empirical inquiry, human logic, and natural law over everything else, including religion. And to be fair, reason was not opposed to a God, a creator, a belief in religion or providence, but it was the ultimate filter for determining truth. Even the few that truly believed in a God were for the most part rejecting divine intervention and supernatural claims. If you're a Christian who is happy that the founders were deist, you don't really understand what that means. Let me give you one more commonality, and I think we'll kind of move into a wrap up. The fourth one that I noticed here is around natural rights and what they're rooted in. Mainly nature, not theology, not scripture. The founders believed that humans had inherent rights. It's built into our founding papers. Not because the Bible said so, by the way, but because they were part of human nature, or even granted by a universal creator, a creator that went undefined. And we hear that kind of language in, say, the Declaration of Independence, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. But that doesn't mean these were Christian men building a Christian nation. And again, these were men that fought and debated and articulated over every single point of everything that they put their name on. So utilizing language like creator instead of God the Father, Yahweh, his son Jesus Christ, the Christian Father, etc., was done purposefully. So take them for what they were doing and stop manipulating it to help fit your agenda. I think it's important to know this stuff. I think that if you belong to a country, you should understand its history. I think that if you're surrounded by a religion, you have a duty to understand its history as well. And what I see clearly here is that these two histories don't co-align in the way that Christians want them and desire them to be. Our identity, our law, our education, and our politics are all being threatened. And I'm not an anti-theist. I am fine with belief. I think that it can be good for some people, and I want people to have the freedom to believe whatever they want. I understand what it is to be a Christian and hear the other side try to take away your rights, because that's how I perceived it. I, who had been raised with these kinds of myths and with the Christian indoctrination, felt personally attacked when I heard debates going on about religious imagery or literature in public spaces. I was offended when people had a problem with prayer in public school. But I see so clearly why those lines in the sand need to be drawn and need to be upheld. And it is not out of hate for Christians. It is out of care for everyone. These myths, by the way, do a lot more than just allow the dominating of one religion politically. They erode intellectual honesty for another. We're teaching future generations to worship a fantasy instead of live in reality. When we lie about the past or sanitize it or try to make it look more moral or more Christian as if those two things should be synonymous, that's silly. But this is the attempt of what Christians try to do. They try to make everything more holy, more comfortable for them, more familiar for their beliefs. Again, a true erosion of truth and reason. These myths also undermine freedom itself. Religious freedom only means anything if it can mean anything at all, if it is applied to all faiths and to a lack of faith. Otherwise, it is clearly just protection for one group and one religion, which is the opposite of the claim. You know what's crazy is that atheists, Hindus, Muslims, even Native American beliefs, Buddhist, non-religious, whatever you want, are all seen as somehow less American than Christianity. That's a problem, obviously, when you have a preferred religion from a federal level. It is going to cause inequality to some degree somewhere. Come on. So to end here, what's really cool to me is that our founding fathers gave us something even better than what a Christian nation would be. They at least tried to give us an open and honest and reason-based and truly free nation, which I will take any day over a Christian nation, a country where your belief is your business, a country where the government does not tell you who to worship or who to be, where reason and debate and even dissent are features and not bugs. And man, they handed it to us on a silver platter, but they knew we would face challenge. That's why they did it the way they did it. And when that gets corrupted and mutated and morphed and manipulated by Christians, we lose that opportunity. That's what I believe. And if it was a different religion eroding that actual freedom of religion, then I'd be speaking about it. But it's not. So choose truth over comfort. That is the mission of this channel, is to be willing to follow truth wherever it leads, however unpopular or uncomfortable that it might be. Thanks so much for watching today. I know this was a longer one, a heavier one, a more political one, all of that, but please try to understand my heart and where I'm coming from. I'll see you Sunday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Craig, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Matthew, my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dan, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, please consider joining these fine people.